we begin our discussion now with another topic of the Jews coming to America. The United States of America has been a Malchus Shel Chesed, a wonderful, wonderful place for the Jewish people over the last couple of centuries. And let's talk about Jewish history, talk about the Jews who arrived here in this country, the United States of America. The overwhelming majority of immigration began, there were Jews who were here in the 17th, 18th centuries, early 19th century. We even talked about the Reform Jews who came in the early and the middle part of the 19th century, but the majority of the Jews started coming, the mass migration of Jews started coming in the 19th century, and there were a few reasons for that. The major migration, where you had over 2.5 million Jews coming, began towards, again, the last few decades of the 19th century, and it was because of the Industrial Revolution. It was because now we had the means, steamships, etc., to travel on a fairly easy basis to get to this country. It was easier now to come. We have discussed in the past, throughout the discussion of Jewish history, why didn't Jews leave their homes because of persecution and move elsewhere? Or why didn't Jews pick themselves up and move to the land of Israel over the course of the centuries? And as we've discussed, you couldn't. To go from one country to another, from one city to another, from one town to another was extremely difficult. It took time. People needed food. You needed money. You needed a job to support yourself and your family. And it took months, if not years, to travel from one place to another. Now, with the Industrial Revolution and the modes of transportation being invented where you could get from one place to another fairly quickly. So under those circumstances, people now were able to go from one place to another. And that's what really began the migration of many people, but specifically the Jews, from one country to another. In addition to that, the United States of America was after the Civil War. The United States was a large continent. It was relatively empty. And now there were opportunities, economic opportunities, and opportunities to improve your life. Because the life in the shtetl and life in the villages of Russia, Poland, Eastern Europe were poverty-stricken and pretty difficult. And your non-Jewish neighbors didn't particularly like you. And therefore, we want to improve our lives. We want to live and have a situation where I can raise my family in a much, much better, more conducive, in a more positive light. And therefore, the United States became a haven, became a destination for many, many, many people, starting in the late 1800s. When the Jews came, they got off the boat. Most of them got off the boat at Ellis Island. Ellis Island in New York Harbor. Maybe many of you have been there, right adjacent to the Statue of Liberty, was a place where people were processed. And this was the place where they were now given entry into this country. Here's a picture of people emigrating and with money from their home country, ready to be able to exchange it for dollars that they could use here in the United States. You see that when they moved to the new country, moved to this country, many of them moved to New York City, and most of them lived on the Lower East Side of New York. Here's a picture of a Judaica store, Talesim and Hebrew books and Svarim. The signs that you see are in Hebrew, Yiddish, and in English. In 1880, there were approximately 80,000 Jews living in New York City. In 1910, just 30 years later, there were over 1 million Jews. And just as an aside, today in 2020, there are approximately a little less than 2 million Jews here in the city of New York, which is between 9 and 10% of the population. Here's a picture of a Shomer Shabbos barber shop. See that? Shomer Shabbos barber shop on Delancey Street on the Lower East Side. Here's a picture of peddlers with their wares and their products that they're trying to sell on the carts that they take up and down the street. And here you have a picture of a kosher butcher shop. And it says, Basar Kosher, strictly kosher Fleisch, and Yitzchak Shlomo Shochet. I'm not sure if his name was Shochet or Shochet means the slaughterer. His name was Rav Yitzchak Shlomo and he's the Shochet. I'm not sure about that. Let's all watch this.
The Lower East Side of Manhattan. It's here where tens of thousands of Eastern European Jewish immigrants arrived in America over a century ago. They lived in crowded tenement houses, many working in sweatshops, and struggled to make their way in the new world. Today, the neighborhood has a very different character. Where tenements once stood, there are Chinese stores and restaurants. Where street vendors hawk their wares, there are fashionable stores, trendy bars, and art galleries. But a walk in the Lower East Side still finds remnants of that remarkable period of new Jewish life in America. The Eldridge Street Synagogue is a testimony to that era. Today, a museum, it is one of dozens of synagogues that were once located in the Lower East Side. With its high ceilings and stained glass windows, it was an architectural statement. Eateries are remnants of a time that defined the American Jewish kitchen. For herring, sturgeon, and lox, there is legendary Russ and Daughters on Grand Street. A few doors down is Yona Schimmel, still making knishes like a Yiddish grandmother. Also on Grand Street is the iconic Katz's Delicatessen, over 100 years old and serving what many consider the best pastrami sandwich in the city. Katz's draws visitors from all over the world. No one goes away disappointed. On Essex Street, there once were dozens of pickle vendors. Today, there's only one, the Pickle Guys. A few blocks away is the Tenement Museum, showing the arduous path of life for all immigrant communities. Generations have passed since the Lower East Side was the hub of New York Jewry, but the remnants of the immigrant story can still be found in the streets and buildings of this historic neighborhood.
So we continue now. But there were other reasons that the Jews had to leave, not only because of economic opportunity and easier travel. Some Jews had to leave. The reason they had to leave was because in 1881, as you learned in European history, the Tsar was assassinated. And this assassination unleashed terrible oppression. Of course, the Jews became the scapegoat, and they had to blame his assassination on someone, so it became the Jews. And that began a series of terrible pogroms, which were focused mainly on the Jews. And as you see, they weren't merely spontaneous outbursts of violence against the Jews, but they were basically orchestrated by the Russians themselves to divert the attention away from the problems of the Russian government and the Russian society and say, the reason that we're having all these issues are the Jews. These are pictures from pogroms that occurred in Russia in the late 1900s. Now, they didn't announce that today is going to be a pogrom, but what the Russians actually did was they said that we're going to be back on Thursday or Tuesday or Wednesday, whatever the date is. So that was an implication that, well, we're going to be back in a couple days, but we're not here today. And that gave permission, so to speak, for those that wanted to commit violent acts and crimes, that nobody would really interfere, nobody would really do anything to those people who would be perpetrating these pogroms. Because of this violence and this hatred, Jews had to leave their homes. They knew what was coming. Sometimes they came back, sometimes they didn't. Sometimes when they come back, their houses were destroyed, their homes were ransacked, their fields or businesses were totally gone. Jews who did come back or who stayed had to pay a price, either their lives, unfortunately their women, their children, their property, and many villages were totally wiped out. From 1882 onward, the pogroms had a serious effect on Jewish life throughout Eastern Europe. We will see when we talk about Zionism that here, today we're talking about Jews coming westward to the United States, but we will see there will be Jews who are going to say, why should we go there? Let's move eastward and try to build a homeland in the land of Israel. Much of that beginning of Zionism, there are many factors, but much of it began because of the terrible economic and political conditions that were happening in Russia, Poland, and Eastern Europe at this time. Okay? And you could see that there was not much future for Jews in some areas of Eastern Europe. And therefore, as we just said, coming westward to the United States was a place of opportunity. Jews would be welcome, and Jews could become part of the fabric of American life. Jews started coming in the early 1880s, as we said, and first major wave began after the assassination of the Tsar. And then a few years later, about a decade later, there were decrees, anti-Semitic, anti-Jewish decrees in Russia and other areas of Russia. There was a pogrom in 1903 in Kishinev, which we'll talk about when we talk about anti-Semitism. And then the failed revolution that happened in 1905 against Tsar Nicholas. Each one of these events was a reason that people said it's time to go, we have to leave. So again, there was 4 great waves of Jews coming to this country. And here you see some numbers. From the mid 17th century to the mid 19th century, there were less than 15,000 Jews total in the whole United States. In the mid 1800s till 1880, as I mentioned just a few moments ago, you had the Reformed Jews coming from Germany, 250,000, 250,000 Jews. Now the Eastern European Jews are coming, over 2 million came. Jews who were able to escape before the Holocaust. Again, very small number because of quotas, which we will discuss in a few moments. Only 100,000 Jews came. After the war, 250,000 Jews, and now we get about 50,000 a year. I don't know if that number is still today, but over the course of the end of the 20th century, that was the number of immigrants to the United States, approximately. Now, who didn't want to come? Who didn't come to the United States? Well, there are basically three main categories of the Jews who said, we're not coming, we're staying. And again, it doesn't only mean the United States, it's we want to stay here. We don't want to go leave our homes. Well, the first group were the religious Jews. They didn't want to leave. And the reason they didn't want to leave was because they didn't think that they would be able to maintain their religious observance and their commitment to Torah and mitzvos in this country. And here you see a letter, a typical letter that might have been sent to relatives in Europe for a family that did emigrate to the United States. They would say, people don't keep Yom Kippur, people don't fast, there's no Shabbos, there's no Kashrus, and that's how the United States became known, at least again at the end of the 19th century, the beginning of the 20th century, as the Treifa Medina, the unkosher country. And the truth of the matter is, it was in that aspect. There was really no infrastructure for Jewish religious life. Yes, there was some pockets of it, but mass migration, there were really no established yeshivos for your children. Kashrus was not exactly prevalent, so a lot of kashrus throughout the country. And the infrastructure for Jewish life was quite in its infancy. And therefore, Jews said in Europe, it's bad here, it's not so comfortable, but at least we can be Jews. If we go over there, if we go to the United States, who knows if we're able to maintain our religious life and our religious standards. And therefore, many religious Jews, unless they were forced to, basically said, we're staying here in Europe. So the Jews who actually did come, the religious Jews stayed, the Jews who came didn't have that much of a commitment to Judaism. They might have looked like Jews, and it could have been they were committed to Judaism and to Torah and mitzvahs in Europe. Once they got here, they left it, they might have probably dropped it. Not everybody did. My grandparents came in the early 20th century. They did not. However, we find that many Jews who did come, unfortunately, some were forced to, some voluntarily, didn't keep Shabbos, didn't keep kosher. There was no place to give your kids an education. And therefore, most committed observant Jews consistently resisted coming to the United States. The second group that didn't leave Europe said, well, the reason it's bad here is because the life that we know it, the political system that we have, doesn't is not the way it should be. But we're going to fix it. And these were the Marxists and the communists, the socialists. They said, this is the way to fix our country. So it's not comfortable now, but we're going to make it where it's fair and equitable for everybody, especially, as we said, after the Russian Revolution. And those people who were committed to the socialism, to the socialist ideas, were willing to rot in the Tsar's jails and hang from his gallows to bring it about. They were not interested because they didn't believe in the concept of capitalism, which was what the United States was built on. And they said, we're staying. We're not going to the United States, that capitalistic country. We're staying here in Russia because we ultimately are going to build the utopian society. And the third people who didn't come were people who were successful in Europe. People of scholarship, people who were wealthy, people who could make a difference. Listen, if you had a good job, you had money, you were successful in Eastern Europe, why would you want to leave? Why would you want to leave? So you stayed and you maintained your lifestyle. People who had nothing to lose left. People who had a great deal to lose stayed. As it says, the general rule in immigration is one who has the most leaves the last. You don't leave unless you have to leave. You want a better life. But if you have a decent, successful, economically good life, why would you want to leave? And therefore, these people didn't leave. So you have the three groups who didn't leave. Primarily religious, those who believed in socialism, and the well-off and educated. So who did come? Well, who did come were the people who had nothing to lose. And they were the ones who came to America, and they're the ones who built America. It's the people who had nothing to lose. It was the poor, the underclass, those who needed to have a change in their life. As we mentioned moments ago, the Jews were welcomed, but this, what we call open door policy, did not last. As more and more immigrants came, the door started shutting. The door was starting to shut. Congress started passing laws aimed at limiting immigration from countries in Central and Eastern Europe. It was not only directed at the Jews, it was directed at much immigration. Many countries from Eastern and Western Europe, there were quotas that people from certain countries were allowed to emigrate. In 1882, an act was passed prohibiting immigration to the United States from anyone who was unable to take care of himself. They didn't want people coming and then the state would have to support them. Well, if a person didn't have any money and he didn't have a job, who's going to take care of you? So, depends how we understand that. In 1891, they added to the act paupers, polygamists, persons suffering from a disease, persons whose tickets hadn't been paid for by someone else. If you fit into any of those categories, you weren't able to come in. And that excluded many people. The only way that people in Europe could afford it was if relatives sent tickets or money to them. And unfortunately, that excluded many Jews. And again in 1891, Congress passed another act. This prohibited the encouragement of immigration by advertising, which was how the shipping lines were so successful. We had to pay the shipping companies, but I only knew that the shipping companies were going if we could advertise, so they weren't allowed to advertise. They would put up posters in Yiddish and Polish and Russian and any other language, but now we couldn't do that anymore. Despite all of the obstacles, despite everything, Jews came in droves and changed the face not only of the Jewish world, but of the European world they left behind and the new world they were now citizens of. And without a doubt, the Jews have made their mark on the United States of America. I want to spend a couple of minutes talking about something known as Daf Yomi, which was invented, created in 1923, not in America, but in Europe, but it is very prevalent today in America, and maybe you know about it, but it's very worthwhile talking about it. A few months ago in January of 2020, maybe some of you attended, I did attend it, the Jewish world commemorated the conclusion of the Daf Yomi learning cycle of studying one page of Talmud Bavli every day. Daf Yomi means the daily page. It takes 7.5 years to finish the entire Shas, the entire Talmud Bavli, learning one page of Gemara a day. The cycle of Talmud lasts, as we said, 7.5 years. And since 1923, it started on Rosh Hashanah of 1923, it has been done 13 times. We just finished the 13th cycle. The picture you see here is of Rav Meir Shapiro. the learning of daily Talmud has tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of participants, and has grown in popularity and strength over the past decades. It is a tribute to the greatness and genius of Rabbi Shapiro that his idea of universal learning of the Talmud has withstood the test of time and circumstance. But it should not be surprising to us, since Rav Meir Shapiro was a special person. Meir Shapiro suggested in 1923 that every Jew should learn one page of Gemara a day. You could learn more than that, but he said, let's universally study that. So therefore, a Jew in New York, a Jew in Los Angeles, a Jew in Moscow, a Jew in Tel Aviv, a Jew in Jerusalem, a Jew in Australia, all are learning the same page of Gemara. So if I leave my house in New York and I travel elsewhere and I go to shul in the morning and there's a shir, we're all learning the same page of Gemara. That was the idea of the Daf Hayomi. He saw Daf Yomi as a tremendous unifying factor among the Jewish people. And he said, very beautifully, if you look at a page of Gemara, you see on every page of Gemara, there are Jews from Eretz Yisrael and Bavel. Right? The Gemara was Talmud Bavli, but the Jews in Bavel, the Jews in Eretz Yisrael, the Gemara is filled with Tanoim and Amoram, who lived both in Bavel and in Eretz Yisrael. And then you have Rashi and Tosfos. Rashi lived in France and in Germany were the Balei Tosfos. If you turn to the back of the Gemara, and we talked about them all year long, there's Rabbeinu Asher, the Rosh, who lived in Spain. There's the Maharsham, who lived in Poland, the Maharam, who lived in Lithuania. If you look at all the Mefarshim throughout the pages of the Gemara, they're from different countries in the world. And he said, the page of Talmud is the most universal and unifying fact in Jewish history, because everyone from every place in the world are all on one page of Gemara. And we learn a page a day, and Jews all over the world learn the same page a day. That will unify and bring the Jewish people together. Again, he started it in 1923. Rosh Hashanah 1923 was he started Brachot, Daf Beis, and it continues every single day from then until today, and it continues. Rav Meir Shapiro unfortunately had no children. He was the head of a yeshiva called Yeshivas Chachmei Lublin in the city of Lublin in Poland. And during the Holocaust, unfortunately, the yeshiva was destroyed by the Nazis, and it never regained students after the war. However, because of Rav Meir Shapiro's insight and idea of Daf Yomi, so the yeshiva, the building still exists today. There's really no yeshiva there, but tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of Jews are studying the Daf Yomi today, and that is how Rabbi Meir Shapiro has gained immortality.